Welcome to the Outside Right podcast.
So welcome to the Outside Right podcast. I'm editor Chris Lee. I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Cole, who's junior researcher at the University of Tartu in Estonia. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. And we're talking about a fascinating, very topical subject today, which is far-right activism within Eastern European football, something we've been talking about for several years. It's getting more and more attention recently. We're going to understand why it's come around as a culture and whether there's any countercultures to that as well. So firstly, though, can you briefly introduce us to you and your work, please?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm Michael Cole, and I'm currently doing my PhD in political science at the University of Tartu, which is in Estonia. But originally I'm from the UK. And my PhD in general looks at the way the far right in Ukraine and Georgia discuss and think about Russia, and how and why this might lead certain far right groups in those countries to get support from particular sections of those societies. My research is actually part of a bigger project, which is an EU Horizon 2020 project, and it's called Delayed Transformational Fatigue, which looks at these trends of illiberalism, populism, and far-right politics across the Central and Eastern European region. I should also mention that I'm a doctoral fellow at the Centre for the Analysis of the Radical Right, and in the process of doing my PhD, I've written some academic as well as more journalistic pieces about the relationship between football and far-right and populist politics, in particular in Poland, Georgia, and Russia.
And this is obviously very topical with what's going on in, say, Hungary, Bulgaria, Ukraine, etc. So, and also because of what happened in Krakow, because I came across your work when I saw on Twitter what you'd written about the sort of anti-Semitism that's going on in Krakow at the minute. So before we crack on then, let's add some context. How do you define the far right in the 21st century Eastern Europe? Because obviously a lot of these are former communist countries until at least late 80s, early 90s. Who are these? What do they believe, and crucially why?
Yeah, great place to start, Chris, because I think there are a few different definitions of the far right, as we were just discussing before, and this can make it a bit confusing. But I think the best definition, the best way to look at it, comes from one of your previous guests on Outside Right, the political scientist Cas Mudde, and he starts by, first of all, clearly defining the difference between the political right wing and the left wing. So those who are on the right tend to have this underlying belief that inequality is natural in a society. And so the government shouldn't try to act to address this. They should allow inequality to happen. Whereas those on the left don't believe in that. They believe that inequality is not natural and that it's the job of the government to try and redress this balance. So when we go a bit further to the right, with the far right, this is an umbrella term which includes all those political parties, movements, and individuals who not only have this very strong belief that inequality is natural, but they also promote an ideology which has basically three main features. Firstly, racism, secondly, xenophobia, and thirdly, nationalism. But within this umbrella term of the far right, Cas Mudde also distinguishes between two separate groups. So there's the radical right, and then there's the extreme right. The difference between them is basically their attitudes towards democracy. So the radical right, which is a phrase that we hear a lot nowadays, but these are the groups on the right who are not opposed to participating in democracy. So they run for election, they try to win power in that way. Whether once they get into power they believe in upholding democracy is another matter entirely, and often they don't. But they differ from the extreme right, who are these groups and people who have little, if any, intention of actually participating in elections and democratic practices. So they often want to take power by other means, usually by force. And so they don't even believe in the outward impression of coming across as democratic. I mean, I think these definitions, of course, are very helpful, and because it allows us to compare far-right groups in the countries that I look at, like Ukraine or Georgia, with some of the more familiar examples in, say, France or the UK. But as with everything, in reality, the lines between these two things, and particularly the lines between extreme and radical, are not quite so obvious and not quite so easy to draw. I would also add that it's really important to note, to mention that for many far-right groups and people who hold these views, a lot of the issues that they're focused on are very much a result of the local and national context in which they operate. But I think it's true that to say that there's certainly an appetite for this, and there's certainly a market for it in sort of Eastern European countries, and there's a tendency for some of these ideas to cross a bit more into the mainstream than perhaps in some other Western countries.
Yeah, and football often reflects what's happening in wider society at large, arguably in the maybe working class male segment at least. So why do you think there's so much sympathy for the far right in former communist-run states, including East Germany, actually, when in Western Europe we see far less of it, maybe with the exception of Italian football?
I think that's a really interesting question, Chris, and I think it's really important to discuss this because football can often be overlooked as an area of interest for political science and other academic fields. But I completely agree that it tells us a lot about the way that societies function. And like you said, certain things that go on in and around football really reflect society at large. I think it's also important not to be too general about these countries, of course. If you're talking about East Germany and Hungary and then Georgia and Ukraine, it's a very rich and diverse region. And they've all followed a slightly different path since the fall of communism. I'm also not entirely sure that there's a significantly more support amongst the general public in Eastern Europe for the radical right than in some Western countries these days, unfortunately. But as I said, there is an appetite for this, and football reflects it. One of the common threads that I think I've noticed in countries that have emerged from communism, though, is that it's been really important for them to deal with pretty big questions regarding national identity and how that's both defined and expressed, both in terms of who these nations are and also who they're not. And this has remained really, really important now, even 30 years after independence in most cases. So, for example, in places like Poland, the discussion and the idea of what constitutes a true patriotic Pole, or the same in Ukraine, what is defined as a true Ukrainian. In the process of negotiating this, some of the symbols and ideas and slogans which have been adopted, and used to say, look, this is who we are, have fostered a stronger sense of who is outside of that and who is not part of that. And I guess perhaps it's this way of seeing the world as divided between a group of us on one side and a group of someone else or them on the other. It seems to fit really well with radical and extreme politics, particularly on the right. But as I said, again, unfortunately, we also see similar things happening in Western Europe, I think, nowadays too.
Yeah, interesting. Can you give some examples then? Because like I said, I came across your Krakow piece, and that was interesting for me because I thought that probably the Jewish population in Krakow has been pretty small since World War II, and then you get this graffiti you mentioned, and also obviously Russian, Hungarian ultras, Ukraine, etc., East Germany, Bulgaria, particularly in England, is known quite well. So, have you got any examples you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, let's take that Poland as an example because this was really interesting for me. I basically spent last year living in Krakow. I was working as a visiting researcher there, and yeah, similar to you. I mean, even before I moved to Poland, I was always curious about Polish football. I'd heard a lot from Polish friends about the two teams in Krakow, Cracovia and Wisła, and especially it always focused on the reputations of the supporters. So I was told things like, don't go out on Derby Day, don't wear the colours of either team, and things like this, and be careful what you say. Of course, I also I know that you did a podcast about their rivalry.
The Holy War, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's what it's known as recently.
Krakow Derby, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I mean, it really is. It's that serious for the supporters of those clubs. So I was really looking forward to going to that game. And I went to a few Cracovia games and one or two Wisła matches before that. But as the derby got closer, I just started noticing when I was walking around the city, particularly in the region quite close to the Wisła Stadium, that there was a lot of this graffiti which was appearing, which was related to the football. Some of it was very specifically about football. You'd see things like Derby blisko tylko Wisła, which means the derby is near, like only Wisła. But then alongside that, there was also quite a lot that struck me as just being quite obviously anti-Semitic. You would see in huge letters, anti-Juda, written on the wall. And then there would be a picture of the Star of David next to it with a line drawn right through it. Juda, of course, being the German word for Jew. Or in other cases, you might see the initials AJ, which stands for anti-Juda, again with the Star of David drawn next to it and a line drawn through it. And, I was pretty surprised by this, bearing in mind, as you mentioned, the history of Poland and the Jewish history, the proximity to Auschwitz. It sort of just shocked me that this was happening. But I didn't want to make any rash judgments. I started talking to lots of Polish and friends about this, and then I started doing a lot more research into the history of the clubs and Polish football in general in relation to this issue. And I think what surprised me the most was that in general it was often just accepted as being related to football and just a part of football, which really struck me as very different from, for example, the UK and things like this. It was widely accepted and known that Wisła supporters would use the word Juda in an insulting way to attack Cracovia fans. And people almost just didn't really notice it anymore. It was so much a part of what was happening and what was going on in the city. So as I delved a bit more into the history and spoke to more people and learned about football in Poland in general, it brought up all these issues again that I mentioned before about this negotiation of what it is to be Polish and how Polish identity is understood and defined. And it seemed to be the same kind of problems going all the way back to the pre-war period. So at the time, there was quite a lot of discrimination against Jews in Poland, as there were in many other places in Europe. And in the 1930s, some of the leading clubs, which included Wisła Kraków, actually banned Jewish and other non-Polish players from playing for them. They additionally appealed to the Polish Football Association to try and make this ban on non-Polish players applicable to all the clubs in the league. They were ultimately unsuccessful, but there was also a very famous incident where the Wisła captain at the time, Henryk Reimann, was sent off by a Jewish referee in one match, and he made a statement along the lines of, from now on, no Polish officer should ever have to obey Jewish orders. And so it was very much connected to the history of the club. Wisła Stadium is actually now named after him. It's the Henryk Reimann. And it became clearer to me historically in this than just a pure antagonistic football rivalry, if you like. The kind of story goes on that basically, as Wisła tried to get these Jewish players banned from playing, there was equally a group of clubs, including Cracovia, who supported the inclusion of Jewish and non-Polish players in their team. So they were on the other side of this debate, if you like. And as a result of defending the rights of these players, they became known as a Jewish club, which even at the time wasn't necessarily considered a positive thing. But since then, there's been this sort of understanding that that's a big part of their identity, and it's really stuck even to this day.
The interesting thing about Poland, I'm just looking at the Wikipedia page.
Yeah.
Well, this is 2011 numbers, but still, it's only 2% of the population is actually ethnically foreign by the looks of it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a big part of why it's such a controversial issue. Poland is a very homogenous society. There aren't too many Jewish people left anymore, and there aren't too many people from other cultures and other races. So this is what makes it such a controversial thing when you have this understanding that Cracovia is somehow considered to be a Jewish club. One of their ultra groups, for example, calls themselves the Juda Gang. And this also partly explains why this anti-Juda graffiti is sprayed in many places around the city, because it's an attack on this group. I mean, I spoke to a few people in my research about this. One of the people I was lucky enough to speak to was Professor Rafał Pankowski, who works for the Never Again Association, which is based in Warsaw. And they do a lot of great work to try and stop racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of discrimination in Polish stadiums. And they were heavily involved prior to Euro 2012, which was hosted by Poland and Ukraine, in trying to get to the bottom of why this kind of stuff was going on and if there was anything that could be done to stop it. And one of the things that came out of my discussion with him was this idea that for many football, certainly the more extreme elements of the football support, this idea of the Jew is considered to be something of a bogeyman. So it takes on whatever meaning the fans of a particular club decide to give it, which sounds a bit complicated. But basically that means
sounds a bit 1930s, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, basically what it means for, say, Wisła Krakow fans or a certain section is that for them, Cracovia are the Jews. So anything that on the surface is apparently very anti-Semitic, for them is aimed at insulting Cracovia. But this is different in different parts of Poland. So in another city like Łódź, the fans of the club there, Widzew Łódź, will also call their rivals, LKS, the Jews. And again, it's a means of insulting them. But basically, and from this discussion with Rafał Pankowski, this idea of calling your opponents Jews as the worst insult you can use, really, it shows that underneath this, there is definitely this underlying sense of anti-Semitism going on. Otherwise, why would it be considered such an insult?
And how do you draw any comparisons with the experience that Tottenham Hotspur fans have? Obviously, because to those not familiar with it, Tottenham has a similar identity, I guess, as a Jewish club because of its North London location more than anything else, and kind of reclaimed an insult from other fans as their own in many ways. But the difference being there is actually probably a sizable portion of their fans who are Jewish anyway. So this is the difference. We're in Poland, we're probably not, right? So how do you draw any comparisons, or do you think there's just kind of just complete out of context insults?
Yeah, I think it's a good comparison to make with Tottenham, Chris, because I think, again, it's the similar idea of the justification is reclaiming what was initially used as an insult against the club and against their fans, and trying to sort of re-own this name. Again, in my research, I spoke to members of the Jewish community in Krakow, which, as you say, is very small. But one guy that was really interesting I managed to talk to is called Piotr Figiela, and he's an expert on Krakow's Jewish history. And he invited me to meet him in his office, which is in the old synagogue in Krakow's Jewish quarter, Kazimierz, which is a beautiful place for tourists nowadays.
Actually,
yeah, it's great. I mean, lots of cool things to do and everything. So I met him in his office, and the first thing that I noticed when I got there was on his desk he had a copy of the book How Football Explains the World by I think Franklin Foer is the author, and he was very knowledgeable about this, and he made the same comparison. He talked about this comparison with Tottenham or with Ajax. He also sort of said that in some cases people who live in the Jewish quarter of Krakow, because of where they live, had come to associate themselves with elements of Jewish identity and culture, even though they themselves weren't really Jewish. So in some sense, there was an idea that by living in that area, by being part of that culture, that they had almost adopted this association. And maybe that was partly some justification for a group like the Jude Gang. However, he agreed that, this kind of anti-Semitist language and graffiti is extremely ugly. But what was also interesting was he talked a little bit about these different levels of anti-Semitism and how, because this was almost considered not so bad as outright violence and other worse forms of abuse, it had kind of been ignored as something to deal with and basically become accepted as quite normal within the society and the city. So that was also really interesting.
So that's Poland. That's interesting. Anyone who's wants to know more, we look at the back catalogue. We've got one on the current state of football in Ukraine, and one about James Montague, who spent a lot of time with East European ultras. On a national or regional level, have politicians sought to leverage this sort of far-right extremism within Eastern European football?
Yeah, definitely, Chris. I mean, there are lots of examples, as you know, of politicians trying to get involved with football, and particularly in this region. One interesting case that I've written about relates to the way the far right tried to get involved in football in Georgia. So Georgia is a pretty small country, of course, former member of the Soviet Union, but it has its very kind of proud traditions, its own language, which is very, very unique, and culture and food. And I became very interested in the case of actually the current captain of the Georgian national team, Guram Kasia. So basically, he now plays for the San Jose Earthquakes in the US, but a couple of years ago, he was playing for Vitesse Arnhem in the Netherlands. And they had one of these initiatives where they were supporting equality in the game and LGBT rights. And all the captains of the Eredivisie sides, the top division there, wore rainbow-coloured captain's armbands on one particular day. So as he was the skipper, he wore the armband himself. Probably didn't think much of it. Everybody was doing the same thing. But back in Georgia, it received a really furious reaction from the far right. So they started, promoting a lot of hate about him on social media. They tried to get to trend, saying things like, "Guram, we are not with you." And they started encouraging supporters to boycott some of Georgia's upcoming international fixtures. And there were some important ones at the time. It was part of a Nations League campaign, which they are still, as we speak, involved in, and we're doing very well at. So, yeah, this kicked up a real big fuss. And sort of the head of those protests were a far-right organization called Georgian March, who have this similar understanding of, a very, very narrow understanding of what it means to be Georgian. And a big part of that is that if you are a member of the LGBT community, you don't fit in with what's Georgian. So they accused him of being unpatriotic and of offending Georgian religious sensibilities. Now, the religious part is very important because I mentioned before in Poland how important Catholicism is in terms of this identity. But in Georgia, the Georgian Orthodox Church is a really political actor. Since the country became independent, it's become synonymous basically with Georgian national identity. So you can't be Georgian if you're not a member of the Georgian Orthodox Church. And the church there has also been very, very outspoken in its criticism of members of the LGBT community. I think you can see some videos on YouTube, and there was an article in the BBC, I think, from 2013, when members of the Georgian church, prominent members, were involved in attacking participants in Tbilisi Pride. So they were actually attacking a minibus in which these Pride participants are kind of hiding from them. And so the far right were kind of able to harness this because of the popularity of the church and its importance in the society to accuse Kasia of basically offending Georgian set ideas of patriotism. So what happened was they basically asked him to apologize publicly, which he refused to do. And he became this kind of figure of defending LGBT rights and equality within Georgia. He said that he believed in the equality of human beings. And it created this sense amongst some Georgian fans that, this was a good figurehead. So they turned up to the upcoming international game against Latvia, and some of them are wearing their own rainbow armbands, or they were holding rainbow flags in support of him. He then won an award from UEFA. They made an award basically called the #EqualGame Award, which he was given the first one for supporting the LGBT community. And he gained some recognition as well from the president of Georgia at the time. Now, he was criticized a little bit in Georgia because people said, well, okay, he wore this armband. It wasn't really his decision to do it. All the clubs were doing it. And then when people asked him about it, he didn't specifically say, hey, I'm supporting the rights of the LGBT community. He just said, I'm supporting inequality in general. But I think that's a little bit harsh personally, because I think, of course, as we've talked already, football and politics are very intertwined. But when it comes to a footballer taking such a stand against so much pressure, I think it's very unfair to expect that. I think it's great when they do it. I mean, we've seen in the UK, for example, the actions of people like Marcus Rashford, which are fantastic. But I think it's difficult to say that that should be the norm and should be expected. And I think in this case, Kasia did a great job. In the article that I wrote, I kind of actually think that there are other people who have a connection to football within the Georgian political environment that probably should be doing more. For example, Kaka Kaladze, who is the current mayor of Tbilisi and a member of the ruling party, famously used to play for AC Milan. And he's also had his own problems with the far right. The same groups attacked him over a different issue. They tried to break into his office in Tbilisi. And he's certainly not a supporter of them. He's never come out supporting them. But I think he's in a difficult position because to stand against some of these groups could also be interpreted as standing against some of those traditional Orthodox Christian values, which are so important in the society. So it's a very interesting case, I think.
One of My most popular post on Outside Right is about left-wing football clubs and fan bases. Does such a thing even exist in the former and Eastern Bloc?
Yeah, this is a very interesting thing, isn't it? Because obviously most of what we're talking about is on the right. And yeah, I mean, there are very few, from what I can tell, certainly very few that have a big number of left-wing supporters. One interesting case, though, that I have come across recently is a group of ultras who call themselves Citizens 161, and they follow the Ukrainian club FC Lviv. So it seems like they're a fairly small group, but they all are also pretty vocal, and they strongly seem to identify as left-wing, which is quite surprising as it contrasts quite strongly with a lot of the other ultra groups in Ukraine, which, for example, James Montague spent time with the Dynamo Kiev ultras. And from what I understand, they're quite politically active. They share a lot of anti-fascist political content on social media. So, there are photos on there of them stamping on white power flags, and they wave the Antifa flags and sing songs about that. They're also supporting the protesters in Belarus. So that would be an interesting group to know more about. Definitely, I find it interesting in the city of Lviv in Ukraine, because their most well-known club is Karpaty Lviv. And they are some of the most well-known as well for having, their ultras for having nationalist views and some direct connections with far-right groups in Ukraine. So it will be really interesting to know more about how a left-wing group, how their identity is formed, whether it's just a response to the far-right elements of their rivals, or whether it came more organically from a left-wing base. I'm not sure.
What needs to change before things kind of get better, I suppose?
That's a huge question, isn't it? And really important. And I think, bearing in mind what's happened in the last year, it's probably wise for me to follow the advice of that well-known political commentator, Paul Gascoigne, who once famously said, "I never make predictions and I never will." But having said that, we're in a situation in general, not just in Eastern Europe, but across the world, where we're seeing an increase in polarization. And of course, on the one hand, that does mean a generally a higher amount of support for the far right. But I think we're also seeing, if we're being optimistic and positive, a stronger response from people further to the left. So, as I point out in the article I wrote about anti-Semitism and football in Krakow, that basically, in this situation in Poland, where things like homophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of racism are deemed acceptable in the society, because we have political leaders who are actively using this language and these ideas to gain and maintain their power, it's hardly surprising that this is seen in football stadiums and might continue to do so. But I think also it's important to point out that clubs do quite a lot of good work in the community, and there is a big sense of community built around these clubs. So I think it's really important to try and emphasize this and focus on these positive elements of what it means to be associated with a club, whilst also trying to combat and deal with some of these more problematic issues that we've been talking with. I mean, I think it's positive that you have organizations like the one I mentioned before, Never Again, in Poland, who continue to draw attention to these issues, both within the country and internationally. And I think on the political level, we've seen some pushback from the EU to some of these anti-LGBT actions in Poland. So hopefully, in the long run, that might have some effect on the societal discourse too. I think in Georgia, I'd also like to be generally optimistic, because even though I think there's a long way to go, the incident with the captain of the team, Guram Kasia, showed that when it came down to it, although the far right and the more conservative elements of society kicked up a huge fuss, ultimately he didn't back down, and a large amount of the society backed him. I know that in Georgia there are some important elections coming up soon, and according to the polls, the far right group support is quite low at the moment. So hopefully that's a sign of things to come. And as a nice coda to that, as we speak today, I know Georgia are celebrating the victory against Belarus last night, which puts them within one match of reaching the European Championships. And of course, Guram Kasia was playing in that game. So maybe football can bring some positivity into that area of things.
Thanks so much. It's been a fascinating overview. Where can people connect with you online and learn more about your research?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's been really great. You can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @NotTheMikeCole. Or if you want, you can send me an email, michael.cole@ut.ee.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Chris.
The Outside Right podcast.
Thanks again for tuning in. If you like what we're doing too, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. There is a load more content on Eastern Europe and political football over on outsideright.co.uk. Follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. And next time we will be back looking at some of the pioneers you may not have heard of in early football. Till next time, goodbye.